Cancel. Good evening, everybody. How are we doing? Couple of things. Let me fix some things first. I forgot to name the video on YouTube properly, so just give me a sec to do that. This is called Western Civ 2 Lecture 16 Cold War. Okay. And save. All righty. So I am going to try and multitask here. I have Zoom open here, and then I'll be tracking your chat here. Try to make this work. I am sitting closer to my router today to make that a little bit easier. Hopefully that works out. Because today we're going to be talking about the early part of the Cold War. We're going to be talking a lot about the sort of the period of time between the end of the World War II and all the way up to the 1960s. So sort of that period of world and European history. But before we do so, I do have some information for you guys. So I got an email from the Associate Dean of History and Social Sciences today that may be of interest to some of you. I know a couple of you sent emails asking about this, and I didn't answer because honestly I didn't know. I just got the details today. So in regards to the no-fail policy, I know a couple of you wanted to take advantage of that. I got sent a document here with some questions that answer some of the questions that you might have here. And so I'm just going to go through as many of these as possible just to make sure that you guys have a sense of what's going on. The first one is, if I'm graduating, can I still choose the no credit option? You can. And it does not impact your eligibility to graduate. However, if you decide to graduate and choose no credit, they will be equivalent of a D on your transcript. So, think about your GPA. If like this is your last semester here and it doesn't look like you're passing, or it looks like you might not pass, bear that in mind, take that into consideration before you start and before you go down that road. The second is, if I choose the no credit option, do you need to complete your course requirements? Yes. You do need to do the basics of the course requirements, and you just elect to not get a grade if you think that your grade's not going to be good enough. Pass grades do not count towards your GPA, but they do provide you credit for the course. So that's better in terms of prereqs, in terms of things in order to go towards your degree requirements. So bear that in mind. I'm going to send you guys this document later today. I'm probably going to make a giant email list and put all you in it and make sure you guys have this available. Or I'm just going to upload it to Canvas and make it available on the front page of the of your course shell, so you all have access to it. You just double check the YouTube, see if there are any questions. Go to the YouTube. No, there are no questions. Okay, good. I think the second thing is related to that is, as of yesterday, I was assigned to teach the same class but online in summer one. Due to the weird circumstances of this semester, a couple of you maybe are not getting the grades that you might want. And if that is the case, but you still enjoyed the format of the lectures and stuff like that, and you want another shot at taking this course again, In conjunction with that previous one, I would, highly recommend that you take a look at Summer One. It's basically this course, but faster, more accelerated. And chances are that you're familiar with the how this course works, how the lectures work, and all that jazz. So if you need it, what I'm saying is, if it's looking like you think, I might not do well in this course, I personally would take a hard look at the no credit option and just retake the same course again in Summer One with me. Not at all biased on that, shameless plug, but just as a general rule, to at least keep your GPA at a solid level. So that out of the way, let's talk about the Cold War, because we've spent the past couple weeks in Unit 3 looking at the big counters to democracy that emerge in the early part of the 20th century, right? If Unit 1 was all about the end of feudalism, and Unit 2 was all about the rise of democracy, and Unit 3 was about the challenges to democracy, well, Unit 4 is all about democracy meeting the final boss, if you will, right? Because of the two counters that emerged to democracy and sort of the Western style system that is created as a result of Western Civ, it is definitely the case that of those two counters, it is the communist, Stalinist, Marxist model that emerges victorious compared to the fascist model. Although, modern times arguably make that a little fuzzier, but at least for the time being, when we talk about the Cold War, we are not talking necessarily about a conflict between Nazism and democracy. We're not talking about a conflict between fascism and democracy. We are strictly talking about a conflict between the Marxist command economies and the democratic capitalist economies. Of those three paths to the modern world that Moore discusses, we've reached the modern world, and the countries that have reached it either took path 1 or path 3. The ones that took path 2, no longer applicable. So I think the question that I want to start this lecture with is, it's a bit of a rhetorical question, which is, how do you not destroy the world if given the power to? Now, that may seem like a bit of a dumb question, like you just don't do it. But what if, for the first time in human history, there is this appearance that mankind has achieved what appears to be seemingly unlimited energy, limitless energy available that you can hold in the palm of your hand? This is what we talk about when we talk about the early years of the Cold War. And it is why the early years of the Cold War and the immediate aftermath of World War II are odd, for lack of a better word. Because a lot of it is about humanity just grappling with the realities of dealing with this newfound power that it has. Because let us not forget here, just minimize this, let's recap our Eichmann trial thing. Eichmann happens at the heart of the Cold War. Like, when we look at the dates here, Eichmann happens in 1960. Other things are happening in the background while all of this is occurring. But when we talked about Eichmann, we used this man as sort of I don't want to say an explainer for the Holocaust, but a lens through which we understood the Holocaust. We said, this is an average person. Well, average might be a strong word. He is not extraordinary. He is not an unusual character of a man. He is in charge of running the trains. And the fundamental question of Eichmann is, how is a man who is so central to the Holocaust, so boring, so mundane, so nothing, like there is nothing exceptional about this man, and yet somehow here he is, central, critical to a policy that exterminated millions of Jews. How is this possible? And we've spent the past week or so talking about this moral question. But in the background of all of it is the Cold War. And when we talk about the Cold War, in the absence in the collapse of Nazism, we have moved away from multipolarity. What do we mean by that? Okay, let me explain. After World War II ends, the last incidents of a truly cooperative nature between all of the victorious powers that fight in World War II, ironically, is Nuremberg. When all of the countries, the Soviet Union, the United States, the UK, France, they all get together and they say, okay, we all won World War II together. Now let's dispense victor's justice. And for the early part, those immediate years after World War II, it seems that these systems, while they do not agree, can at least coexist. And the word for this is détente. It's a French word that means, I believe it means de-escalation, or like neutrality with each other. Like we don't agree. Like, there are some seriously, important differences of opinion between the American system and the Russian system, but they can agree to get along. That in the grand scheme of things, collaboration is possible. But it quickly becomes clear that this is not the case. A lot of the early years of détente happened because of, ironically, an unlikely friendship. Roosevelt and Stalin, for some reason, just get along in one of history's most unlikely friendships. It is a strange thing to have, these two men from complete opposite backgrounds. Roosevelt, comes from one of the wealthiest families in America, related to a former president. And Stalin is a boy that grew up poor in Georgia and somehow made it to the upper echelons of power in Russia by essentially scheming his way there. And yet somehow these two guys get along great. They both have a very particularly dark sense of humor, and this is part of why they get along great. The problem is Roosevelt dies in 1945. Yes, 1945. And Stalin dies in 1952, which means that almost immediately after these two men are gone, it becomes abundantly clear that détente is not going to happen. And, as a parenthesis, as an aside, if you look back to, how Stalin viewed the world way back when we talked about the NEP, détente sort of makes sense. Stalin is many awful things, but warmonger is not among them. Right? He was not out there to go to war. Stalin's policy, if anything, was the opposite of that. Socialism in one country was very much sort of like an inward-looking style of socialism compared to people like Trotsky, for example. And sort of that's consistent with what we know about Stalin. But when Stalin is removed from power and Khrushchev, pictured here, comes to run the Soviet Union, immediately the policy starts to change. And a couple of things need to be discussed in order for us to truly understand what's about to happen in the Cold War. I think the first thing is to understand what bipolarity means. When we talk about a bipolar political system, what do we mean by that? Well, it doesn't mean what it means in psychology. Let's start with that. Bipolar disorder has nothing to do here. Bipolarism in international relations, bipolarity in international relations, is the division of power, in this case understood as military power, between two major camps in the world system. Those camps being the US and the USSR. Now, of course, they all have their clubs, they all have their cliques and their coalitions, right? The US has NATO, that's where that comes from. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is essentially all of America's friends from the Cold War, which is now expanded to include a whole bunch of other countries. But the USSR has this thing called the Warsaw Pact, in which it brings together all these countries in Eastern Europe that are now part of communism. So countries like Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, all of these Soviet republics, and countries in Central Asia too. Kazakhstan is also part of the Warsaw Pact. And this is sort of a defensive treaty between all of these things, but let's be clear, it's Russia that's running it, it's the USSR. And in a bipolar system, we talk about this concentration of power, but what political scientists in particular, not to get off track here, but this is mainly my field of study, mainly my field of I think I mentioned this in the very first class of person. I'm not a history major, if that was not obvious. I don't come to this from a history background. I come to this from a political science background. And in particular, this is what I studied in political science. This is my jam. And so these two powers maintain peace through what is we call balance of power theory. The idea being is that the two powers do not fight if their power is roughly the same. Why? Well, there's a principle in balance of power theory called MAD. Well, move forward, think about what that might stand for. So as an example here is an example of a multipolar world. So here is the world during World War I. So as we see here, we have our two major sides, Russia, France, Germany, and Austria, and England as a peacemaker. Its role in the system is sort of structurally constrained in that it will join whichever power is necessary, is required to maintain the balance of power. So this is how you maintain balance of power in a multipolar system with a whole bunch of different countries. You maintain it through a system of alliance, right? But that's no longer possible in a bipolar world. Because in a bipolar world, well, look at all of these countries on the board. Let's look in here. Oh, sorry. France, destroyed after World War II. Austria, destroyed after World War II. Germany, destroyed after World War II. England, blitzed to hell during the early part of the 1940s. Which means that in our bipolar system, none of these countries are available. And so we talk about these countries in particular. In a bipolar world, all of this power, the power to control other countries, hegemonic power, is concentrated really in only two sides, the United States and the Soviet Union. And these two powers never confront each other directly due to this thing that I said before, MAD, which stands for mutually assured destruction. If the United States and the Soviet Union go to war with each other, they will both destroy each other in the process. And so you maintain peace by having both sides either increase their weaponry at the same time or decrease their weaponry at the same time. But it must always be balanced. Only it is not sufficient to say that this is mutually assured destruction, because it is not just the destruction of the United States and the Soviet Union that's at play here. Because the end of World War II, alluding to what I talked about at the beginning of class, brings with it a new element to conflict. Mutually assured destruction is now also globally assured destruction. Because now, while the United States develops the nukes first, they are very, very quickly, the plants of them are very quickly stolen by Russian agents in the United States and brought to the Soviet Union. And in fact, the Soviet Union would deploy even larger weapons, nuclear weapons, than we did. The largest nuclear device ever detonated remains the Tsar Bomba, which is this gigantic nuclear bomb exploded in the hinterlands of Siberia. And so the stakes here are rather high, because if any of the two sides go to war with each other, well, they will not just destroy each other, they will destroy the world in the process. And so direct conflict is impossible. They cannot go to war with each other. In fact, if you look at the history of the Cold War, they don't. There is never a point where Russian soldiers and the American soldiers are fighting each other. Never happens. This is why. But this is not to say that the Cold War has no war at all, which is why personally I rather hate the word Cold War. Because when you say a Cold War, it implies that there is no hot war, there's no actual fighting. But that's just not accurate. That's not true. There's not a lot of fighting in Europe, but the Cold War doesn't seem very cold if you're Vietnamese. The Cold War doesn't seem very cold if you're from the Congo or from Korea, right? The Cold War is plenty hot. It's just not hot in the places that, we study as a part of this class. And that's why the Cold War gets that name. But let's be clear, this is not peacetime. This is, tension. And so I've alluded to this, but in order for the two sides to compete, they can't go to war with each other directly, but they can go to war with each other indirectly. And that's sort of what happens. The two sides fight over the rest. They fight over all of the other countries that are available to be fought over. Today, we're going to talk about three crises. I call them here flashpoints of nuclear war. Because while the nuclear war of the Cold War never happens, we do get close. We do get uncomfortably close to annihilation. And these three conflicts, three flashpoints are the Berlin crisis, the Korea crisis, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. But before we do so, I think it's fair to talk about these two men in particular, Khrushchev and Kennedy. Now, before we get into this, I think we need to talk a little bit about the 50s, because we sort of skipped over the 50s. Kennedy's elected in 1960. And there is one thing that we associate with the 1950s. When we think about nuclear war, when we think about this potential, I think the question you should ask yourself is if every morning you woke up and there was a 5 to 10% chance that the world would end that day, that any day you wake up is the last day that you have on this earth, how would you live your life? What would that do to you as a person, as a society? How would you go around living your life? I'm sure, guarantee to you, in fact, that you would live your life a little bit differently. And each of the decades of the Cold War, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, partially because of generational change. This is the first time we're really going to see the effects of generational change as we go into a granular and year-by-year level. And remember what I said, Unit 4 was going to stop feeling like history and start feeling like present. Generational change is going to be one of those elements that we're going to start looking at, because the 1950s are dominated by people coming back from World War II. And the people that will come of age in the 1960s are too young to really sort of make a big cultural impact. And so the reason why the 1950s are the way they are, white picket fences, clean hedges, all of these things are the way they are, because the cultural impact of thinking that the world might end tomorrow in the 1950s is to pretend that it's not happening. To pretend that not only is this problem not happening, but it's to pretend that no problems are happening. After all, the economy of the United States in the 1950s is phenomenal. It's fantastic, partially because it's the only one still going after World War II. The United States has a similar advantage that England has when we talked about the Napoleonic Wars, right? It leaves World War I and II with no damage to its infrastructure, no damage to its cities. And so by definition, that's the one that's going to be at the top of the food chain after two major world wars. But the cultural impact of the Cold War in the 1950s is to pretend that the problem is not there. In fact, is to pretend that no problem is not there. Sexism doesn't exist. Racism, we pretend it's not happening. The 1950s is the way it is for this reason, right? To go against social mores, social taboos in the 1950s is such a big deal, exactly because you're not supposed to break this sort of pretending everything is fine mentality that a lot of these people who survived World War II have. And the idea that something here is fundamentally wrong doesn't happen until the late 50s and early 60s, when the generation, that was too young for World War II starts to grow up. And as we're going to see in Monday's class, this goes hand in hand with Vietnam. But we will talk about that more in detail. Kennedy comes to power in 1960. And the things that we associate Kennedy the most with, things like civil rights, Great Society, these are not things that Kennedy runs on. We often forget this, but Nixon, who runs for the first time for president in 1960 against Kennedy, is to the left of Kennedy on a whole bunch of things. Kennedy is not running as the civil rights hero. Kennedy is running as the Cold Warrior the country needs. There is a pretty famous line in one of the debates between Nixon and Kennedy, where Nixon says, yeah, sure, the Soviets are ahead of us in armaments and rocketry, but we're ahead of them in color television, as a way to say, well, we have a better, more attractive society. And Kennedy hits back and says, well, I think rocketry is a little more important than color television, and a little more dangerous than color television, because they are approaching the prospect of war differently. And so Kennedy goes in thinking he's got to manage the crisis. He's got to manage the Cold War. And Khrushchev knows this. Khrushchev is older than Kennedy. Khrushchev is a wilier character than Kennedy is. And so he has a different strategy to his predecessors in terms of how he's going to win the Cold War, now that the Cold War has been dropped on his lap. If Trotskyism was dangerous in its ambition, and Stalinism was dangerous in its practice, well, Khrushchev's brand of socialism was dangerous because it combined both. Khrushchev says, yes, we need to perfect socialism in one country, but we also need to win the Cold War. And so the way we do that in the most cost-effective manner is to simply stretch the United States. Because in a one-on-one conflict, the United States will beat us. But what if we do to the United States what the millennia ago the barbarians did to the Roman Empire? What happens if we cause crises everywhere and force the United States to be everywhere? And because the United States gets stretched so much, and we're going to create so much paranoia in the United States that they feel that they have to meet us everywhere, well, then maybe we can win. So Khrushchev gets on the floor of the United Nations in 1958, during Eisenhower even, and says, we are grinding nuclear weapons like sausages. We are pushing them out of the factories. We will bury you, is the line that he uses. The idea is, of course, to create fear. A scared American president, or worse, an American president that fears he's going to lose re-election unless he appears just as tough as Khrushchev is appearing, is more likely to screw up, is more likely to make a mistake. And so Kennedy goes and meets with Khrushchev, as you see here for the first time, in Vienna, almost as soon as he becomes president. He's inaugurated in 1961 in January. In March, he's already meeting with Khrushchev. And there's sort of they need to set the rules of engagement, because neither men, contrary to the rhetoric, actually wants war. They don't want conflict and they don't want to screw up. But again, Khrushchev plays Kennedy, for lack of a better word. Khrushchev gets Kennedy involved in a battle of ideology and not a battle of pragmaticism. You know, the difference between these two men and the difference between Stalin and Roosevelt is that Stalin and Roosevelt, for all their flaws, and in Stalin's case there were many, but they're both ultimately very pragmatic people, right? It's not necessarily about ideology, it's about the results, no matter what the cost. In Stalin's case, these guys are more ideologues, and so they get into it. They argue, you know, the historical conflict between socialism and capitalism, and not how are we going to not go to war. And so nothing is solved. And immediately, the flashpoints begin. Now, the first major flashpoint of the Cold War predates Kennedy, but it continues all the way up until today, where we have to talk about the Korean crisis. So the model that is applied in Germany after the Germans win the Allies win against Germany in World War II was, if no agreement could be found on what system to follow, the country would simply be split and have a capitalist half and a communist half. This happens in Germany. You get East and West Germany. But this also happens in the places that were invaded by Japan. You know, we didn't really talk about this because this is not a World History 2 class, but during the Cold War and in the years leading up to Cold War, Japan had, you know, was not just limited to Japan. Japan had invaded Korea and had invaded parts of China, Manchuria, had invaded islands in the South Pacific. You know, and they created a Japanese empire, for lack of a better word. And when the Japanese empire collapses at the end of World War II, the question of what to do with Japan's biggest extra Japanese holding, Korea, becomes a rather salient one. And so the Allies decide to split the country down the middle along the 37th parallel, create a North Korea and a South Korea. And that is a balance of power that exists to this day. The problem is that no one asked the average Korean whether this was a solution that was acceptable to them. This was done in the broader scheme of geopolitics. Remember, balance of power. Peace is maintained, and the balance. Peace is maintained by keeping the power of both sides, the US and USSR, in balance. Because the minute one skews towards one end, here's what happens. Either the country that is more powerful believes, I might actually be able to win a thermonuclear war, or the country that is weaker panics and overcompensates and launches nukes because they think they're losing. So what's there to lose? And so Korea is split. Almost immediately, as soon as the split happens, war breaks out between North and the South over unification. They're led by Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung is Kim Jong-un's grandfather. Kim Il-sung invades the South and nearly wins. We forget this, I think, partially because of the explosion of South Korea in recent decades. But for a very, very long time, if you were an average person living in 1955 and you had to decide, did you want to live in North Korea and South Korea, you would pick North Korea, because most of the factories, most of the jobs, most of the better standard of living were available in North Korea. South Korea, for the most part, was mainly rural and agricultural, mainly involved in rice production, and were led by a proto-fascist dictator who was propped up by Western powers because they said, oh, it's that or communism, and so they went for the dictator in this sort of police state. And so North Korea basically has South Korea on the ropes. It beats South Korea all the way down to the southeastern corner of the country. I don't know specifically the name of the city where the last stand is, but that corner of the country. And sort of the United States gets involved at this point. Now, this is the first instance of a post-World War II conflict, major conflict. The United States views this as a breach of the peace that is established after World War II. And so they get involved along with other countries, and the Korean War really gets underway. And with the help of the United States, the opposite happens. The United States and Korean armies beat the North Koreans back all the way up to where the border with China is. But communist China, freaking out that there's an American army on their border, intervenes on behalf of the North Koreans. And so the North Korean conflict ends in a stalemate, as both sides, backed up with a major power behind it, essentially go back to where it was. But importantly, conflict is avoided. Major conflict, at least, nuclear conflict, great power war is avoided. Now, the second major conflict is the one of Berlin. Now, Berlin is in a bit of a weird situation geographically because both East and West Germany have their capitals in Berlin. But Berlin is not located in the center of the country where you could have a nice clean border down the middle of Berlin. Berlin is located smack in the middle of East Germany, smack in the middle of communist held territory. You have this little enclave of capitalism in Berlin. And what ended up happening is a lot of people in the Eastern Bloc, in the communist side, would grow up and get their education and training on the capitalist side, on the communist side, and then cross over into West Berlin and work the high-paying job, and then cross back into East Berlin where the cheaper apartments were. And so this is how it would work. They would get the benefits of both systems without paying the price for both systems. Khrushchev hates this. Khrushchev sees the presence of West Berlin as, in his words, a bone in his throat, which had to be extracted. And so he keeps threatening to close off the city, to close it off. And eventually what he does is he shuts off all entrance into and out of the city. He says, no one in, no one out. The idea is we're going to starve Berlin. Eventually, they will give in. Kennedy sees this. And what he does is, in one of the craziest stories, which, hold on a second, I actually have a book on this. In one of the craziest stories, Berlin airlift. If you may know, the Americans have an airplane base in Stuttgart, Germany, where it's mainly a refueling base. Right now, it's mainly used as a stopover between the United States and other countries, especially in the Middle East during our campaigns in Afghanistan and Iraq. But at the time, it's where we parked all of our B-12 bombers. And so Kennedy decides he's going to fill these B-12 bombers with supplies and just airlift them over Berlin and drop them off into Berlin. I want you to imagine something. Imagine you're a East German border guard. You wake up that morning, you're going to, doing your post. You look into the sky and you see these World War II bombers flying towards you. You might correctly assume, oh my God, it's World War III, we're doing this. But turns out the B-12 bombers ignore repeated warnings for them to turn back, and they drop supplies down. And one of the things they drop off in sort of a show of strength is candy. They're nicknamed the candy bombers because they drop from the sky chocolate, Skittles. I swear to God, it starts raining Skittles in West Berlin. It's crazy. But the idea is that not only are we able to give West Berliners supplies, we're also able to give them so many supplies that we can even give them candy. Around this period, Kennedy flies into West Berlin and gives the famous speech where he says, Ich bin ein Berliner. He wanted to say, I am also a Berliner, but what he doesn't know is that a Berliner is not someone from Berlin. A Berlin is German for jelly donut. And so Kennedy gives a speech in which he loudly and proudly proclaims, I am a jelly donut. I always found that story hilarious, but yes, history is a little weird like that. But you might think the crisis is solved. But one day in October, middle of the night, West Berliners wake up to hear the sound of concrete being poured and jackhammers. When they wake up, they find a wall being built, sometimes in the middle of streets, in the middle of backyards. We call this the Berlin Wall. I actually have a piece of it somewhere. I should have had it ready, but yes, the Berlin Wall. Now you might think that the Berlin Wall, this enduring symbol of the conflict of the Cold War, is this awful, awful thing. But I would point out that, arguably speaking, had the Berlin Wall not gone up, conflict would have likely occurred over West Berlin. It's very ironic, but the ultimate symbol of the tragedy of the Cold War is also the thing that prevented the war from happening in the first place. Because by erecting the wall, Khrushchev indicates to Kennedy that he has no intention of invading. Why would you invade if you just built a wall, right? Why would you make your life more difficult? By erecting the wall, essentially, war is averted. It's a tragedy. It's a human tragedy of unspeakable proportions, but war is averted. And the last one, the most famous crisis of the early Cold War, is the one having to do with Cuba. Now, Cuba has a long and complex history with the United States. Some of you may remember from your high school classes about the Spanish-American War, about how we'd gone to Cuba already. During the 1950s, Cuba was run by the Batista government. The Batista was the name of the, it would be unfair to call him democratically elected. It is more like oligarchically elected president of Cuba. And this president was really, really comfortable, really, really close with the United Fruit Company, which we now have renamed into Chiquita, bananas. And the United Fruit Company's whole deal was to have large plantations of bananas and citruses and other fruits that grow in hot climates all over Cuba. And a lot of poor Cubans were working on these plantations in sometimes atrocious conditions. And it is not surprising, therefore, that Cuba becomes a hotbed of revolution. The Castro brothers, Che Guevara, all go to Cuba, and they really view Cuba as sort of the symbol of what in their eyes was American imperialism. Now, we can argue about whether or not this is an accurate statement or not. We can argue about whether this is not a poli-sci class. The fact of the matter is, this is what they were arguing. This is what they were saying. And the fact that, again, similar discussions to what we've had about people like Martin Luther, right? What is fascinating is not so much that the revolutionaries exist. What is fascinating is that the revolutionaries were listened to. And that this moment in time, a moment in which you have America and the USSR duking it out over global dominance, here you have this plucky island full of revolutionaries able to successfully take on a large corporation and win. Now, Cuba falls to communism, essentially. And Russia, the Soviet Union, views Cuba not just so much as a geopolitical foothold into America's sphere of influence, but also as like a symbolical victory. Because capitalist or socialist, everyone could agree that the plight of those farmers in particular in Cuba during the 1950s was awful, and that that Batista government refused to go. And so because the Russians saw, this plucky island of a poor people taking on the man, for lack of a better word, they said, see, this shows our movement to be historically in the right. Think of it as them speaking think of them speaking of it in the same terms used in books like Darkness at Noon, right? Where they view themselves to be on the morally correct side of history. And this is an example of that. Now, that, of course, ignores the historical reality of what the Castro regime ends up doing. But at the time, 1960, the narrative around Cuba was different. Now, of course, I mentioned this is a symbolic victory for the Russians, but it's also a geopolitical victory for the Russians. I guess parentheses, words I never thought I would say in this class, a brief introduction to rocket science. Nuclear weapons, how do they work? Specifically nuclear rocketry. Part of the reason why, and this is also going to get into why, the North Korea problem. Part of the reason why rocketry is so difficult is because it's not like a plane. You're not shooting it horizontal to the ground, Mission Impossible style, heading towards San Francisco. Instead, nuclear weapons nuclear rockets at least, are essentially launched into space, and then they drop down towards Earth. That is why it's so difficult, all right? And it's why for countries like North Korea, having long-range ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, is so hard, because they basically have to make a space program that can then also turn around and drop on command. So long-range nuclear missiles are hard to produce. Medium and short-range nuclear missiles, however, are really easy to make. And so the closer you are firing from, the less distance the nuke has to travel, the easier and cheaper it is to make a whole bunch of them. And this is why Cuba is so important. And this is the heart of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because Russia begins to park large amounts of its nuclear arsenal in Cuba, because it is a lot easier to hit the United States from Cuba than it is from Russia, from Siberia, from all of these places. This means that Cuba represents not only a symbolic threat to the United States, but a geopolitical one as well. Now, before Russia starts to park the nuclear arsenal in there, Kennedy thinks, okay, I got to get involved here in Cuba. This cannot stand. And so what does he do? A lot of Cubans had fled the Castro takeover and escaped to Florida. That's why Florida has so many Cubans. What do? They set up recruitment centers all over South Florida. And these recruitment centers say, seeking young Cubans willing to take back their country. What these young Cubans don't know is that these recruitment centers are run by the CIA. And the thing they're planning is an event that we now refer to as the Bay of Pigs. Essentially, you have a bunch of young patriots who are trained militarily, or trained, given a crash course on how to invade a country, and then put on boats and sent to invade the country. Now, last I checked, giving a bunch of teenagers guns and like a week of military training does not an army make. Footnote, see World War I. And so what happened when these soldiers landed on the beach in Cuba and started fighting against actual trained soldiers of Cuba? Well, they were annihilated. The Bay of Pigs is an abject, absolute failure. It's a failure both because the CIA severely underestimates just how many Cubans were willing to pick up arms and go invade Cuba real quick. And also they severely underestimate just how committed the Cuban revolutionaries that stayed in Cuba were willing to defend their country. You know, the Americans thought that as soon as these soldiers land on the beach, so many Cubans are going to join them and it's going to be like a revolution 2.0. Doesn't happen. And so this makes Kennedy really suspicious about CIA telling him to get involved in Cuba. So when reports come to him through the CIA that, hey, the Russians are parking their nukes in Cuba, Kennedy wants evidence. So what do? They got a bunch of these U-2 spy planes. That's what they're called. They're like these little single-person spy planes that are hard to detect on a radar. It's where, parentheses, it's where the name of the band comes from, close parentheses, to fly up and down the coast, the northern coast of Cuba. And what they spot all up and down the coast are soccer fields. Now you might think, okay, so what? Well, sports fans will know this. What sport do Cubans play? Cubans play baseball. Russians play soccer. And so immediately this is taken as evidence as, aha, there are Russians in Cuba. And sure enough, more pictures are taken and they find the launching sites. You can tell that these are nukes. Suddenly, panic mode, because now the U.S. can be targeted from Miami to Seattle. All the continental United States can be targeted by Russian nukes. This has given the USSR an unsinkable territorial advantage over the United States. Balance of power threatened, you know, alarm bells should go off. And that's sort of what happens. At the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, people were afraid that they were going to die, that they thought, this is it, it's game over. The United States essentially puts its entire Navy around the island of Cuba and says, no ship goes in or out until those nukes leave. Now, the Russians, being unwilling and unable to take such open provocation, pointedly ignore this. They have a ship full of supplies and nuclear material, take one ship and they start sailing it towards the blockade. It's literally a game of chicken. Who's going to blink first? And at the end, it's the Russians that blink first. Kennedy was unwilling to budge on this, and the Russians turn around. In the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, you know, the Cuban Missile Crisis ends with a sigh of relief, and with both leaders sort of realizing in that moment that they had come far too close for comfort. Which is why, in the immediate aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1963, something called the START Treaty is signed. And the START Treaty essentially bans nuclear testing in the upper atmosphere, the air, and underwater. The idea being that these are commons, right? So if you detonate a nuke underwater, you're not just destroying your own fish, you're destroying the fish of the entire world, right? If you burst a nuke in the air, you're poisoning the atmosphere for everyone, not just for you. And so, you know, this they agree that this is not an appropriate thing to do. However, and both of them come with an understanding that maybe it is time to back away from openly hostile Cold War negotiations. And I also, you know, not to seem conspiratorial. However, later that year, through a not at all rigged vote, Khrushchev is removed from power rather acrimoniously and replaced with Leonid Brezhnev. and JFK gets on a fateful plane to Dallas where he is shot and killed. Read into that what you will. No aspersions made here. Also because like I enjoy living. I guess I think the final note is to point out how the 1960s are different to the 1950s. Remember what I said, the 1950s, the reaction to the, near destruction and impending destruction of the world was to pretend that nothing was wrong. Well, the 60s are almost the opposite of that. I guess, have you ever wondered why boomers focus so much on the 60s? They pretend the 60s were amazing, the 60s were incredible, the 60s were yada, 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 yada. Why? Well, because the 60s are, I think, by far the most consequential decade of American history, at the very least. Because if the reaction to the Cold War, to like we might die tomorrow in the 1950s, was pretend nothing is wrong, the 1960s reaction was to go nuts. Lots of people seek deeper meaning in the world and their lives. And I think it's no coincidence that the two extreme, like people looking for, if I think the world might end tomorrow, I want to find a deeper meaning in my life. I want to find a deeper meaning in society before the world takes it away from me. And so you have people that become hippies, free love, people who are reevaluating concepts that are core tenets of American society: money, property, politics. All of these things get questioned and re-examined. But also leads to a darker equivalent of this. It also leads to the rise of a typically American phenomenon, the cult. The cult leaders, all of these things also happened in the 1960s as people seek out meaning in the hills over LA in California or in Jamestown in Guyana. They seek deeper understandings of their life, because what do they have to lose? The world could end tomorrow, literally. Remember what I said, how would you live your life differently if the world might end tomorrow? And I think the question is a lot deeper than you might realize. And we have not even talked about the most important phenomenon in the 1960s, which we're going to talk about on Monday, and that is Vietnam. Now, I guess fair warning, the class on Vietnam is a rough class to get through. I'll be the first to say that. And so bear that in mind. Before we get through this, I think one last thing, I had a couple students asking about the discussion sections. So here's the deal with those. Discussion sections are all going to get graded at the end of the course because they don't officially close until the end of the class, right? They have due dates and you're supposed to do them by those days, but they don't close necessarily. So let's say I grade the discussion section for this class, and then next week a couple of you guys add to the discussion. I don't want to have to go back and regrade each and every discussion each and every week because one person, two people decided to add stuff. So at the end of the class, I'm just going to look at all discussions and grade all of them. I think that's easier for everyone's sanity. Also because in the broad scheme of things, you're not getting a bulk of your grade from those discussion sections, right? You're getting a bulk of your grade from the final and the stuff like that, which, nice segue, finals start. I mentioned this on Monday, but I will get on your case. The final is not designed to be done over. It's not an all-nighter sort of assignment. It is not meant to be done that way. It's not designed to be done that way. You will be miserable if you try to do it that way. It is not meant to be done like that. You can do it. You can try to do it. I can't stop you, but you will be miserable. You will be upset. You will have a hard time with it. And then you'll come complaining about why you're late. It's like, oh, I'm sorry, I lost track of time, yada, yada, yada. I don't care, right? I'm giving you the most amount of time that I can give you, because any more time that I give you gives me less time to grade, because I also have due dates. Those due dates are a couple days after you guys submit them. So I need to give myself time to grade too. And the longer you take, the less time I have. So that due date is set in stone. Get it done. And that's all I'm going to say on the matter there. So I'm going to stop the sharing here. If no one has any questions, I am going to log off. I thought that was a pretty productive lecture. Questions, you know how to reach me. I will likely send out some kind of Google form. Due to teaching in the age of COVID, I'm looking at ways to make discussions a little bit easier, and I'm looking at Microsoft Teams as a possible option. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that. If you've been using that for other classes, if you've heard of it, if you've used something like that. It seems to be similar to Slack, which I've used in a professional environment, but again, I've never fiddled with it. So I wanted to get your input on that. So I think on that note, I am gonna call it a day, unless I see any questions in the chat, which I do not. All right, guys, you take it easy. Have a good weekend. Please stay safe out there. Wash your damn hands. You know the drill. Bye.